and some of the conflicts that Jesus had with the scribes there. And since I wrote one lesson, but it was way too long, I broke it into two parts. So this is Jesus Disputes with the Scribes, Part 2. If we had had a bulletin this morning, I was going to call it Jesus' Decisive Rebuttal, or something like that. Because that's basically what we're going to be looking at when we pick up in chapter 20 in verse 41. Luke chapter 20 in verse 41. I want to remind us of a couple of things that are important. Number one, of course, I pointed out last time that while Jesus' main opponents throughout the Gospel of Luke have been the Pharisees, from the time he enters into Jerusalem and the Pharisees make their last snide remark to him in chapter 19, that's the last mention of them in the whole Gospel. From this point forward, it is the chief priests and the scribes who are disputing with Jesus and arguing with Jesus and trying to trick him and trap him in something he might say. And when that doesn't work, they are the ones who wind up orchestrating his death on the cross. Another thing, of course, we want to kind of briefly review the argument that they had. They begin, after Jesus drives out the money changers from the temple, in chapter 20, they ask him the question, "Where is your authority, Jesus? What gives you the right to kick our money changers out of the temple? What gives you the right to disrupt our work and our worship in such a way?" Well, of course, Jesus turns their question on its head and asks them a similar question of whether the baptism of John was really from heaven and from men. And thus they are unable to answer that question and their own question. Then Jesus tells a parable of the vine growers, wicked vine growers, tenants who are unfaithful to their master. They refuse to give him the harvest, and they abuse and kill every servant that he sends to him. Finally, he sends his only son, and thinking that surely they'll listen to my son, and they'll realize I'm serious about this. But instead, they think, oh, look, this is an opportunity for us. We can kill the heir and take the inheritance for ourselves. And so they kill that son, and thus condemn themselves to death. And of course, what happens is this prompts hatred from Jesus' opponents because they realize that this parable is in fact told about them. They try to trap him in a question, should we pay our taxes to Caesar? A question that is designed to divide Jesus' opponents, divide Jesus' followers, regardless of who he answers. Because if Jesus says, well, no, we shouldn't pay our taxes, they can take him to the Roman government and charge him as an insurrectionist. But if Jesus says, well, yes, we should pay our taxes, they can discredit him in the sight of all of his followers who believe that the Messiah was there to overthrow the Roman Empire. But Jesus is pretty clever. That probably doesn't surprise any of us. He makes them answer their own question. That they should give to Caesar's what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And finally, the Sadducees, many of the priests were Sadducees, but the Sadducees confront Jesus with a question about the law of levirate marriage and the resurrection. And they concoct this ridiculous story, one that's very similar to something found in the apocryphal work of Tobit, actually, where a woman marries 7 men who all die without having children, and ask the question, well, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? It's designed to make the resurrection look ludicrous because you have 7 men fighting over 1 woman. Well, of course, Jesus says you have a false view of who God is and you have a false view of how the resurrection works. And he exposes their hypocrisy, first by explaining to them that there is no marriage in the resurrection because there is also no death. And secondly, that we know that in fact the dead are raised because God is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. And if he is God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there must be a resurrection of the dead. Well, all of these things have gotten said, and in verse 40, the final statement is made that they did not have the courage to question him any longer about anything. This brings us to Jesus' rebuttal, and really comes in 3 parts. First, Jesus asks them a question they can't answer. He said to them, "How is it that they say the Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet.' Therefore David calls him Lord. And how is he his son?" Now, admittedly, the text does not tell us what their response is here in the Gospel of Luke. In the other Gospels, there is a Matthew and Mark in particular, it's emphasized that they don't have an answer to this question. It is a question that they don't answer. And it really kind of boils down to understand what Jesus is doing here. You really kind of have to understand the background of what the Jews thought of the Messiah once again. That there was this belief that this anointed figure would come into the world, one who was foretold in the prophets and in the Psalms, one who, based on Psalm 2, would be the Lord's anointed, and based on the promise to David in 2 Samuel 7, to raise up a descendant and seat him on the throne and establish his house forever. Well, they believed that that anointed figure, that Messiah, that Christ, would be a descendant of David. And it was generally conceded by all that yes, whoever this Christ is would be a descendant of David. But this raises an interesting question. Because in the 110th Psalm, the Lord is talking to a figure very much like the one we see in Psalm 2, a figure whom the Lord will establish as ruler over the nations, as giving him a scepter in Zion. Everything about that sounds like what they perceive to be the Christ. But in the opening line of that psalm, in Psalm 110, it says, "The Lord, Yahweh, says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." In other words, David refers to this individual whom God is going to subject all to his feet. David refers to this individual as my Lord. Now, typically, you go around calling people my Lord. How many of you call your children Lord? Doesn't happen. How many of you are going to call your grandchildren Lord? Well, it doesn't work that way. People who are descended from someone else don't refer to their descendants as Lord. If anything, it's the other way around. And yet, the implication here is that the Messiah will ultimately be greater than David, even though he is the son. Now, Luke's account records no answer from the religious leaders. Matthew's account, in Matthew 22 and verse 46, explicitly says that they had no answer to this. They had no rebuttal. Now, this may not surprise you either, but since the time of the Gospels, there's a lot of Jewish rabbis who have sat down and tried to do just that very thing. They have tried to write a rebuttal to Jesus' question and try to answer it. Now, you can go on the internet and look this kind of stuff up. Most of these rebuttals kind of disintegrate into these angry, vitriolic rants, these ad hominem attacks, saying that the gospel writers didn't really know what they were talking about. There was one rabbi saying, David wasn't talking about himself when he said, "my Lord." Several of them tried to say, my Lord isn't really the Messiah. And another tries to quibble about Greek and Hebrew words. But none of the rebuttals answer Jesus' question, interestingly enough. They all try to deflect. They all try to say, Psalm 110 isn't really talking about the Messiah. But you can compare the language and see for yourself. In Psalm 2, he says, "I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the ends of earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, you shall shatter them like earthenware.'" Who is he speaking of? He's speaking of the Lord's anointed, the one against whom all the nations of the world had conspired. When you turn to Psalm 110, you see the same kind of language being used. He says, "The Lord will stretch forth your strong scepter from Zion, saying, 'Rule in the midst of your enemies.' Your people will volunteer freely in the day of your power, in holy array from the womb of the dawn. Your youth are to you as the dew." Verse 5, "The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings in the day of his wrath. He will judge among the nations. He will fill them with corpses." This picture of this guy that the Lord makes his deputy, that he that just steamrolls the nations of the world and obliterates them from their positions of power. Who could this be but the Messiah? This is the same figure that is being talked about in Psalm 2. And I highly suspect that everybody in Jesus' day would have agreed upon this point. But the problem is there are several things in Psalm 110 that they don't know how to deal with. One, of course, is the famed verse in verse 4, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek," which I'm not really going to get into that this morning. That's, if you want to know more about that, read the book of Hebrews. And the other is this statement in verse 1, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand, until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." And the fact is, if we look at the context of Psalm 110, Well, we're seeing really just one glimpse of a huger theme in the Psalms. The subjugation of the nations of the world to the Messiah. God's going to take every kingdom in the world and He's going to subject it to His anointed king. The nations might conspire to stop this. They might try to put an end to it, but they will not be successful. The Lord will win in the end. It's clearly, Psalm 110 is clearly talking about a kingly figure. Verse 2, he's holding a scepter. He's ruling in verse 3. And he's shattering in verses 5 and 6, very much like Psalm 2. I don't know of a way to say that this psalm isn't talking about Yahweh's anointed one. It shares too many affinities with similar psalms. And David calls this person Lord. He calls this descendant of his Lord. The point is this: even though the Christ was descended from David, He would be greater than David ever was. As Paul writes in Romans 1, He was born the son of David according to the flesh, but He was declared the Son of God with power. And how did that happen? How was Jesus declared to be the Son of God with power? Well, according to Romans 1:4, it was by the resurrection from the dead, by the Spirit of holiness, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Well, they can't answer this question. And they ultimately, of course, this assumes and demands that there be some kind of resurrection of the dead, because what would make somebody greater than David? Well, David's dead in the tomb. He's been there for a long time. His grave was with them to that day. But Jesus would be raised from death, never to die again. Psalm 110 implicitly talks about the resurrection of the dead. So, in a way, you might also see this question as another refutation to this idea of the Sadducees. They had this idea that the dead are not raised, and Jesus kind of jabs at them and hints at it once again with this psalm. Of course, Jesus isn't done with His decisive rebuttal. In verses 45 through 47, He gives them a charge that they can't refute. And while all the people were listening, He said to the disciples, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love a respectful greetings in the marketplaces and chief seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance's sake offer long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation." Now, Luke is emphatic in verse 45 that Jesus makes this charge in an obvious public place. That while all the people are listening, He says this outrageous thing about the scribes. It's a public defamation and deconstruction of the high and mighty religious leaders of that day. Beware of the scribes. Now, the Gospel of Matthew has a similar thing, although Matthew's is much longer. It takes up the bulk of chapter 23 in the Gospel of Matthew. But what's so bad about the scribes, though? I mean, Jesus, these are the guys that knew the Scriptures. They've worked very hard to copy the Scriptures and to teach them to other people. They're working in the tradition of men like Ezra. Why are you being so mean to the scribes, Jesus? They've done so many good things, right? Well, why is it that Jesus says they're bad? Almost everything in these few verses has to do with saving the appearances. Now, appearances do not matter. The only thing that matters is what God thinks. We don't look at what man thinks. We don't look at how man sees. The Lord does not see with man's eyes. The Lord looks at the heart. The more energy that Christians spend on appearances, the less energy they are spending on God and what really matters. Well, what is it that the scribes are doing? Well, they're walking around in long robes. It's a show of holier-than-thou piety. Matthew elaborates on it further by describing the lengthening of tassels and the broadening of phylacteries. And you might say, well, doesn't the law command things like tassels and phylacteries? Doesn't the law command things like, giving God our best? Well, the truth of the matter is that if we are doing these things simply to be seen by men, we have a very severe problem in and of ourselves. They love the respectful greetings in the marketplace. They are obsessed with claiming a title for themselves, claiming a position for themselves, claiming how great they are. Matthew's account spends a good deal of time on that point as well. Don't call any man on earth your father. Don't call any man on earth your rabbi, because you have one father, you have one rabbi. And I don't think Jesus' point there is literally never call anybody father. Otherwise, your kids are in trouble. I'll just say that. You can't call anybody daddy. No, that's not the point. The point is that if you insist that someone calls you by a special title, that's the height of human pride right there. And nor is the point, well, Jesus only has a problem with these two titles, but you can call him anything else. Well, that's not the point of the text either. It's all about, if I were to go around insisting that everybody calls me, Preacher Wayne or Minister Wayne or whatever, there'd be something wrong with that. Why would I do that? What would be the point of that? I have no interest in calling in a title for myself. All Christians are supposed to be ministers. All Christians are supposed to be servants anyway. All Christians are supposed to ultimately, be proclaimers of the gospel in their lives. And, whether your title is pastor or preacher or bishop or priest or father or rabbi or elder or minister or evangelist or chaplain or whatever else you can come up with, you're taking the title to be seen by men. You are violating the teaching of Jesus. You are insisting that people call you something. You are loving the respectful greetings in the marketplace. That sort of thing has no business being among the people of God. We are all brethren before the Lord. Well, and then you look what else. They love the chief seats in the synagogues. And they love the places of honor at the banquets. Well, what is that like? Do we have that kind of thing going on today? Well, most of the time, we were having this conversation beforehand actually, there's no assigned seating in church. People just kind of sit where they do out of habit. There was a time when people would buy their pews and they would pay money for the really good seats. That sort of thing doesn't happen so much today. Where you sit isn't really a matter of status symbol. But at the same time, Jesus is openly critical of this kind of behavior. Just like at dinner parties. When someone comes to my house to eat, we don't have a special seat for the guest we like more. Well, in the ancient world, people did that. They sat at a table and they gave special seats to the people they liked more. They get, some people would get to dine at the high table and the special enclave, and other people would have to go sit out on the porch or whatever. It's like the rich man and Lazarus. So Lazarus wants to fill himself with the scraps from the rich man's table. How's he even getting to the table? Well, the truth is, Lazarus probably would have been at his table and probably would have been seated at a very low place of status. Admittedly, that's conjecture since it's a parable, but all the same, Jesus has already been openly critical of this kind of behavior in Luke 14. In verse 8 of Luke 14, he says, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor. For someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this man. And then in disgrace you proceed to occupy the last place. But when you are invited, go and recline at the last place, so that the one who has invited you comes. He might say to you, friend, move up higher, and then you will have honor in the sight of all who are at the table with you. But everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. What prompted that statement from Jesus is in verse 7 of that same chapter. He spoke this parable to the invited guests when he noticed that they have been picking out the places of honor at the table. They're picking out the best seats for themselves. They're picking out the most distinguished positions for themselves. They are maneuvering whatever social situation they're in to make themselves look greater and better than everyone else around them. Now, we may not do that at dinner tables today. We may not do that in our synagogue or our congregational meeting here today. But do we ever try to manipulate a situation to make ourselves look just a little bit better? Do we ever, try to... I can confess to doing this, whenever you're in a conversation with somebody, do we have to one-up everything that somebody else says? Do we have to win the conversation that is taking place? Something to think about. It's not about being first. It's not about looking better than everybody else. If you're obsessed with looking better than everybody else, you're going to have a bigger problem. What do you look like to God? What do I look like to God? Well, we may, as the church in Sardis claims, having a reputation to be alive, behold, John said they were dead in Revelation chapter 3. The church of Laodicea, that lukewarm congregation, so oblivious to everything else. They say, I am rich, I've become wealthy, I have need of nothing. He says, but you do not know that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. Revelation chapter 3, verse 17. Appearance's sake. We can be very careful about what we do for appearance's sake. We come into a congregation like this, it's very easy to pretend to be something we're not. It's very easy to put on a show. We have to lead public prayer. Much easier. I mean, there's a situation there where it's, the temptation to impress is present. But what about when it's just us? What about when it's just us and our family? Are we a different person there? Do we treat other people differently? Do we behave differently in our home than we do in the place of the Lord's people? Is our anger more vitriolic and more evident when we are in our homes with our families than it is when we are in the people of the Lord, when we might be more likely to hold our tongue for appearance's sake? Do we, for all practical purposes, put on a mask and dress up nice and pretty to disguise the fact that we are all really wretched sinners who are unworthy of the Lord who has bought us? And may God help us to see and to learn the danger of becoming too obsessed with appearances. Don't clean the outside of the cup. Clean the inside first, and then the outside will be clean all on its own. That's the lesson we get from the Scriptures. They devour widows' houses. How do they do that? Well, how would somebody devour a widow's house? Is it made out of gingerbread or something? I don't know. That's probably not what it was. And we'll see an example of this in chapter 21 in just a minute. The widow gives her mites to the temple of the Lord. Well, and as a result of their wickedness, that house that she gave money to, the house that she gave her entire life savings to, would ultimately be destroyed because of their wickedness. And what about prayers? Long prayers offered for appearance's sake. Let me ask you a question. Is it wrong to offer a long prayer? No. And you know what? I mean, here's the length of prayers as the Bible mandates it. All right? You cannot. The longest prayer we have record in the Bible is in Luke chapter 6 and verse 12, where Jesus prayed all night. So as long as you're under that, you're okay. And the shortest prayer we have record of the Bible is in Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 4, where he prayed silently between the king's statement of, "What do you request?" and Nehemiah's answer, which probably wasn't very long. So as long as it's longer than that, you're okay. That's your range. All night, instantaneous. There's nothing wrong in and of itself with praying a long prayer. The problem is the motive, always. Because why offer a long prayer? If we are offering a long prayer because we have something to say to the Lord and we need Him to hear it, and we need Him to hear our request on our behalf, by all means, pray. Whether private or publicly, I mean, may it never be that the day comes when somebody in a congregation of God's people says, "Oh, worship went too long today." Oh dear, we wouldn't want to accidentally worship God too much, would we? That would be, atrocious. No. The motive for the prayer is something else. Now, I can't judge motive, and you can't judge motive either. The only person that can judge motive is the person offering said long prayer. So if you are offering long prayers, simply to be seen by how pious you are, how thoughtful you are, simply to be seen by men, you are not being heard by God at that point. You are being seen by men. That's something to consider and take note of. So consider those things, and that's the charge they can't refute. All these things they do simply to make themselves look good. Why do I do things? Why do I preach? Why do I study the Bible? Why do I offer prayers? Why do I sing? Why do I come to an assembly like this? Do I do it to be seen by God? As Keith mentioned in his prayer this morning, God who is our audience? Or do we do it to be seen by men? Not to edify men, but to be seen by men, for men to think, "Oh, he's so holy, he's so righteous, he's so spiritual, he's so pious." That is not the goal. And when I offer a lesson like this morning, my hope and my prayer is this: the people will not tell me, "Oh, you're such a good speaker. Oh, you're so well presenting." No. My goal is that people will walk away with a better impression of who God is and what He expects of us. And if you forget the messenger but remember the message, I will consider that to be, the job well done. And all glory be to the Lord for that. Thirdly, a generosity they can't match. Luke chapter 21 in verses 1 through 4. This is not a great chapter division. I know it's surprising to hear me talk about chapter divisions that aren't very great. Following up the comment about devouring widows' houses, we have an actual account of a widow. He looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury, and he saw a poor widow putting in 2 small copper coins. And he said, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all of them. But they all, out of their surplus, put into the offering. But she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had to live on." But once again, this is another lesson about how appearances can be deceiving, misleading. Because you know who appears to give the most? The people who are actually putting the highest cash values into the treasury. That's what appearance says. And maybe they're, Jesus doesn't judge their motives. Maybe they're offering it for appearance's sake. Maybe they're just offering because. This is another example of how Luke's gospel is constantly emphasizing that the good news is for the poor. From Luke chapter 4 onwards, he's been proclaiming that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. All the while, Jesus has been offering quite a few criticisms of people who are rich. The rich are putting their gifts into the temple treasury. But the poor, this poor widow, puts in 2 small copper coins. Let me ask you a simple question. Who gave more that day? Well, according to Jesus, the widow gave more. The rich were giving their leftovers. They were giving their surplus. They were giving the stuff they didn't need. After taxes, this is how much I need to give up. The widow gave up, maybe they were giving a lot. If they had posted their budget numbers that day, they would have had a really big contribution. Because, you got all these rich people putting things into the plate. But the widow gave up her livelihood. She gave up everything she had to live on. And that wasn't going to make a lick of difference for how the temple was constructed, but it makes a difference in the sight of God, because God sees not as man sees. And in that respect, because the charge of they can't answer is a charge of focusing on the appearances, the generosity they can't match is one that is not concerned with appearances, but concerned with what is inside them. You know what the point of this story is? The point of this story is not, you need to give more. Which I've heard it used that way in many a collection talk over the years. No, the point of this story is we need to stop looking at things that are outward. We need to stop looking at things as if they were all judged by human standards. Congregations of God's people should not make decisions based on what will make their biggest contributors happy. Big contributors should not think they have power or control among God's people. That's not how it works. Sometimes you hear about cases like this, and I'm grateful that I haven't heard this here. But sometimes you hear about cases like this where, the church will be meeting together and they're trying to make a decision about something, and one of the members pipes up, "Well, if we don't do it this way, I'm pulling my contribution check out." Well, that's not a basis for decision making. Money is not a sign of a congregation's health. The hearts of the people are the sign of its health. The treatment of one another, the glorification of God, the love for the Lord. Those are the things that matter in a congregation's health. But a number, a monetary number, that is not our health. You know what the temple was very good at? The temple was great at meeting their budget quota. They had the most beautiful of all the buildings. That's what it says in verse 5. The very next verse, they're talking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts. This temple is very well funded. It's a beautiful building. They've got everything they could possibly want. But that temple and that city is something they can't save. And we're not going to read 5 through 38. I'm saving that for next time, where Jesus gives his discourse on the destruction of Jerusalem. What do you think the money changers in chapter 19 were doing? The Bible doesn't tell us what exactly they were doing that made Jesus so upset. It just tells us Jesus' accusation. You have made this a den of robbers. But nothing in the text is actually said about them stealing. Do we know that they were stealing? Well, they were robbing God. They came to the temple not to worship the God of heaven, but to buy and to sell and to trade and to make a profit. And maybe you could examine their books and see that they're all completely legit and they're all completely above board. It doesn't make a difference. The reason why they have robbed God is because they have taken what should have been the Lord's and they have spent it all looking at themselves. They have taken the time and the devotion that should have been given to the worship of the true God of heaven, and they have taken that energy and devoted it to something outward, external. The buying and selling and exchanging of money. They had become, even if they were so complete, even if there was no actual theft taking place from the human standpoint, it's still robbing God. They were serving their other master, their real master, mammon, money. You know what the temple gets for all of its great financial prowess? Do you know what the temple gets for having established itself so greatly in the financial sense? Do you know what the temple gets because it has been made so beautiful and adorned? Oh, we might say, but this is a way of bringing glory to God. This is a way of making things look wonderful. This is a way of converting people even, we might think. False! For all of the great financial prowess of the temple, they get destruction. In verse 6, Jesus says, "As for these things which you are looking at, the days will come in which there will not be one stone left upon another, which will not be torn down." For all of its great financial prowess, the temple was a spiritual disaster area, doomed for destruction. Now that's a lesson that I think every congregation of God's people today can learn from. Because at the end of the day, it is not about how much money is in the bank. It is not about how nice the building looks. It is not about how great of a job we think we're doing in terms of contribution. What matters is, are we bringing glory to God or are we not? Are we giving our true livelihood, not just of our wealth and finances, but everything that we are, as a living sacrifice to the Lord upon the true altar of His people? Or do we have something that we're still holding back for ourselves? Do we have a love for the Lord that is not fully demonstrated the way it should be? Do we not consider enough how to stimulate one another to love and good works? Do we not think enough about building up one another in love? And maybe we think quite a bit about it. The Apostle Paul said, "As to love of the brethren, we urge you to excel still more." The congregation that is wealthy before God is not the congregation that has the money in the bank. It is the congregation that most successfully imitates Jesus Christ and His love, His sacrifice, His selfless, suffering service. And I hope that is something that we will continue to strive for here as we make our way to be pleasing to the Lord. Take out your songbooks. Jesus' words to the scribes, they're not just instructive for that time. They're instructive for all time. And it may be, as we've talked about this morning, it may be that you're here and you're preserving appearances. And maybe you're keeping up this facade that everything's going well and everything's going the way it should be and your life is right with the Lord. But inside you're terrified. And inside you're struggling. And inside you are weak and sick. Well, look within and see what you really are for a minute. And think about it. What do we need to do? If our life is not right with the Lord, make it right. Why would you delay? Why would you continue to maintain the mask? Why would you continue to wear the disguise that Satan has provided for you? Perhaps you're here this morning and you've never been immersed into Jesus Christ, and you need to make that right. Perhaps you're here this morning and you're your basic understanding of who Jesus is kind of, you kind of let that grow lax, and you've kind of let the application of that fall to the wayside for whatever reason. But what we are here this morning to do is to encourage one another and build one another up. Because we all have the same goal, and that goal is heaven. That goal is being with the Lord for all eternity. It's a place where I want to be. It's a place where I know you want to be. It's the place where the true temple of the Lord is, the one that can never be torn down or destroyed. So I urge you to consider and to give yourself to that. If there's anything we can do to help you make your life right with the Lord, let it be known. All together we stand and we sing.